Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am Luke Bevere, a senior consultant at Mutual Ventures and the learning program lead for the Trailblazer program. This is the second webinar in our series where we are taking a deep dive into the most pressing family justice and children's social care topics, where we'll be sharing learning from across the DFJ Trailblazer program and the wider children's services sector, and exploring what this means for professional practice, system working, and the future of the sector. For today's webinar, I'm very excited to welcome two excellent speakers who have been leaders and change makers in children's social care in England. We are joined by John Pearce, former Director of Children's Services at Durham County Council, and Dr. Beverley Barnett-Jones, MBE, former Associate Director at the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. I'll be introducing the two of them shortly, but first of all, just wanted to give a bit of context. So today's webinar is part of the DFJ Trailblazer program. This program began as a pilot running from late 2024 through to early 2025, and the aim was to reduce delays in public law family justice by supporting 5 DFJ areas to understand what was driving delay locally and to help them to design and implement their own local solutions. Alongside the pilot, a guided learning program supported a wider group of DFJ areas to work through a similar process. This was drawing directly on learning from the original Trailblazers, and this helped to spread insight about common challenges and approaches that were already being tested in practice. And then building upon that work, the program then moved into phase 2, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. So the National Learning Support Programme was expanded across the country, and from September 2025, this was reopened to all DFJ areas in England, with a focus on sharing learning, building capacity and capabilities, and supporting areas to reflect on and strengthen their own local practice. Through this programme, in the past 2 years, we have worked with 26 DFJ areas across England. And running alongside this has been the system functionality work, which looks at what was the family justice system needs at a national and a local level to work more effectively overall, including data, accountability, and how different parts of the system work. So in terms of today and today's webinar and our conversation, we will be focused on exploring how meaningful change can be delivered within local children's services and family justice systems. Welcome, John and Beverley. It is great to have you both with us today. We're very grateful for you giving up your time to speak with us. And just as a quick point of order for everyone, so we will be having a conversation with Beverley and John today, but there will be space for question and answer. So do make the most of that. There should be on your screen an opportunity to input questions into a Q&A box. So as we're going through the conversation today, do please add those in, and we'll make sure we'll have plenty of time to answer those as we go. But to kick us off, so John, I'll turn to you first. And from your experience as a DCS, how visible was family justice within the wider local authority and partnership landscape, and what tended to push it up or down the priority list?
Yeah, thanks very much, Luke, and afternoon, everybody. I think from a DCS perspective, the level of visibility of family justice within the system is probably not at the level it needs to be, and that's for a range of reasons. So, as a DCS, you have a range of priorities and challenges, and can often spend a substantial proportion of time firefighting, responding to immediate issues. And as family justice isn't necessarily front and center of the wider system, they can often seem to be on the fringes if you look at the context we work in terms of some of the immediacy around political, finance, inspection activity, broader safeguarding challenges. That can lead to a bit of a disconnect. I think some of that stems very much from a lack of national policy direction, and in particular, join up into the wider system driven from national government, and a bit of a disconnect across Department for Education and Ministry of Justice, but also, within Department for Education. So a really good example of that is if we look at the Families First reforms that are really fundamentally reshaping the children's social care landscape and developing a new model around family help and connectivity. Family justice is almost entirely absent from that if you look through the totality of that system reform. And actually, if we want family justice to be a really core component part with that level of visibility in the system for all the stakeholders and partners, that can't be right. And we need to see family justice much more within that continuum. So I think what that's led us to is a world where, in reality, at a local level, the level of focus on family justice within the children's services system, particularly from a local authority perspective, I would say, has become increasingly dependent on individual interests, relationships, or where there's been real specific local context that has driven that involvement, and that can't be right. We need to move to an arena where it's much more embedded into our everyday work. There's a real problem, when children and families interaction with the family justice system, whilst it might be a relatively short period of time in the overall level of interaction that we will have with children and families, it's such a critical element and can have such long-lasting consequences and real permanent impact on the future for the child or for the wider family. That unless we really start to think much more systemically about how family justice works, then we need to we've got a real issue. I think I'll hand over there and pass on to Beverly for thoughts. But I think how we go about tackling some of those challenges in that context is something we probably want to revisit.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with every word that John's expressed there. I think, in particular, the lack of the national leadership, the national drive on what the policy and practice shape should be, what the framework should be for or local family justice systems. Certainly, my whole experience has been around the relationships and its individuals and the relationships and the desire to improve or see things differently as to why things are happening. But that doesn't come from national, that came from a local context with individuals. And sadly, when those individuals move on or retire, those initiatives can sometimes disappear or not expand because there isn't that national drive or commitment to them. So yeah, it is, as John says, the when you are a family or a child and you're going into a family court system, you are having decisions made about your life that are fundamental to your future. They shape the next step. They shape generationally what may be happening with families if we're looking at perhaps permanent removal of children from their birth families. So this is a critical juncture, even though it's a short period, it's a critical juncture for what happens next around the children's journeys after court, and what that means for children's social care and other multi-agencies that are responsible for supporting and meeting the needs and supporting families. So yeah, it's a sticky one, but it's really important that we find a way of prioritising that. I really agree with John. I myself have been raising in my previous role and now, family first and the necessity for the systems to learn from each other about what family first could mean for children who then have to, for whatever foundational reasons, meet the family court. The family court needs to be ready to receive what family first means for those children and what the likelihood would be in terms of perhaps reduced numbers, but perhaps cases of such complexity which require, a sort of broader understanding of the journeys that these children will be following, and particularly, we have very little understanding of their outcomes after orders are made. There are big data issues there for family justice, which I know many people are working on to try and get right.
Mm. Yeah, thank you both, and I think that's a kind of a um, point really well made, and we do know that this is something that central government is looking at in a bit more detail
Mm,
in terms of
mm,
an upcoming family justice strategy that will look to address some of these challenges. So we do know that this is something that is being thought about. Um, Beverly, I wanted to kind of pick up with you a little bit more in terms of the kind of family justice system at a local level and what that looks like, and how much that, and your kind of your view on how much a local family justice system sees itself connected to and part of that wider children's system, and what the implications of those connections are where they're potentially weak or a bit fragmented.
Well, it's difficult to work local family justice systems when we're talking about the fact that we have a kind of big gap around the national. That's why there's going to be this national strategy because there's a recognition there needs to be some key foundations laid for what a family local justice system should look like. But I think on the level of where we sit, local family justice systems are obviously see themselves as connected to the children's system because obviously, applicants are the local authorities. There's CAFCAS that represent the needs of children, and obviously the court are often dealing with the distribution of resources and finite resources. They don't manage them, but they are talking about health resources or education resources to meet needs of children. So the family court is touching on these issues all the time. But it doesn't necessarily see itself as being part of that wider children's system. It's certainly connected to it, but not necessarily sees itself as part of it. And that's really about the way the family justice system, particularly the family court from the 1989 Children Act, has kind of evolved in its role. So in that sense, there's realities that are there that are yet to be tackled in that national picture. One is that obviously we have institutional separation. There's a children's system, there's a statutory system, there's the multiple agency systems. There's obviously the critical, function of judicial independence, and what that means for a court. The court does not manage services or provide services because those are state responsibilities. We have that separation of power. We have to talk in those ways because we need to remember that even though sometimes there's frustrations about the gaps that occur because of that, there are certainly different cultures and mandates. And there is a contested space there because within the local family justice system, there's a recognition that we have different mandates, but there's a desire to bring about a collaboration as much as possible on the common causes. So we all have the welfare principle. We're all driven by that welfare principle that shapes everything since the Children Act. But we do have a reality where one system sees itself as operating, around provision, support, intervention, safeguarding, and another one which is around looking at a process of decisions, and looking at evidence and operating a sort of procedural fairness to ensure that whoever are parties in a proceedings, the balance of fairness and justice and access to justice is there. And these shouldn't be mutually exclusive, but they often end up being the space where the conflict can occur in the system, where the fragmentation can occur in the system, because there are different understandings about remit, what's possible, and what in reality is being delivered. So I would say, for example, we know all about the difficulty of delaying proceedings because there's arguments about resources and who's going to fund those resources. Judges, courts can't tell local authorities what to do, but they can strongly indicate that they're not happy about something unless something else shifts. And that often means the applicant having to go and speak to partners, and often partners have those fragmentation in terms of children's partnerships aren't great and provision isn't there. The burden often falls on the local authority to be the cost bearer. And so bearing costs for health needs or unmet health needs, for example, is the classic one. And that means the funding comes from local authority pots, not health pots, although there's an argument that we know our health colleagues and the rest, that's another debate, but there's major issues there. I think there's also, the issues that we have, around the fact that we have limited intervention options sometimes in the family court because there aren't those resources there, which has an implication for the local family justice system. Because if you think about your communities, and we're looking at sort of fundamental structural harms that are in communities, poverty, health inequities, significant family generational stories around mental health or other unmet needs. The family court, can make a decision, because we don't get to the root causes, those families come back again through the system. So there is an issue here about how does the family justice system need to see itself as part of the wider children's system. So we start actually creating flows, of decisions that make sense in terms of the bigger story of prevention, intervention, sometimes late intervention family court, but directed towards prevention. And that's a major issue. Which is there as well. I just want to say something really important for me though, Luke, which is like there were two things that really came to my mind when I thought about this question. And one of them is that because of that fragmentation, the system doesn't learn very well. So the family court system isn't learning very well and it's only just getting itself into what is data, what is evidence. And I'll give my former organisation a real hat on that one, because it was set up to dedicated to fill that space. But it is a system that isn't learning very well. And so where the court is responsible in terms of making final order decisions, do we know what the outcomes of those are? We don't know very well. Do we locally know very well? No, we don't either because we've not got the structure, the data structures around that are required. But it's also a story about children's developmental needs, and what the court process can do with that, because it can either slow down decision making, which can be harmful to children who need to be moving through to some sort of permanency. But it can also do the reverse. It can miss opportunities to promote and strengthen families because it's not connected to the wider story of what, say, Family First is about. So, there are critical sort of issues there around the fragmentation. But the hope is that where you have movement and change, such as an FDAC, such as courts that are operating a problem-solving approach, such as the private and private law, the Pathfinder, you do see some glimmers of hope. You do see some green shoots emerging about a system seeing itself as a part of the wider journey of those children that enter it for that small period of time.
Yeah, I think that's a point really well made, especially on that kind of that need for more intervention and problem-solving approaches during court. That's not just something that should happen earlier in the process, but it should also be considered later. And something that we've actually got an upcoming webinar as part of this series, which we're looking at that in a little bit more detail. That's for next Tuesday for those who are here listening and still want to sign up to that. But John, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to come in and add to what Beverly was saying.
I mean, I'd absolutely agree entirely with Beverly's comments, and I think one of the core elements for me is you look back at the Family Justice Review, it's what 15 years old now, talks about a system that's not a system, a system that doesn't have the core components you would expect a system to have, and I think 15 years on, we've probably not moved massively forward from there, and I think that creates a world in which at a local level you systems are trying to mitigate those barriers, and there's some fantastic examples after there's a number of great examples of problem solving approaches, and which have just been discussed that have sort of emerged despite the system barriers that exist rather than being supported to flourish because of the system barriers, and that means they're not sustainable. And we're seeing that through some of the Trailblazer activity certainly in the public law space, where how sustainable is some of that activity that even if we understand it works and we evaluate that it works, because of the system barriers, it's not able to flourish and to be scaled up and to be rolled out across the country, and we need to change that. Every local family justice system operates in a different way. They're different scales. They've got different infrastructures. There's a core dynamic in them where there's a relative power imbalance in terms of the individuals around the table quite often as well. So all of the mechanics that you would want to see in place to enable things to operate, both within a national and a local system, don't currently exist, and we've known that for a long time, and we've tried to work around it. But I think we're very much at the stage where that's not possible.
Yeah, thank you both. And then sort of for us to sort of begin thinking about what then are the potential opportunities, and especially the opportunities for local systems to start thinking about and considering in a bit more detail. And Beverly, I wondered if we could come to you first. So if family justice were to function more consistently as a system, what kinds of foundations or building blocks do you think would need to be in place?
Oh, hey, you're asking me the $64 million question now, aren't you? But I'll give it a go. I certainly, there's nothing here that I'm going to say that people haven't said before, which is kind of what John is saying. We've been at this a long time in terms of our reflections on what's working and not working well. But certainly for any system to function well, we need to have a sort of set of shared purposes and principles. Now we have got shared principles because we have something called the welfare principle, which actually binds us all when we're looking at making decisions about children who are at risk of significant harm, because that's when the family court becomes involved. It doesn't become involved with the family justice system into the whole massive world of children in need or children in need of early support or intervention, but it certainly becomes involved with children who are placed at significant harm. So if we had a sort of clear, articulated system-wide sort of purpose, we've been arguing at NFJ for a long time that should be focused on children's well-being. The idea of a kind of promoting relational safety and actually thinking about what we mean when we say timely permanence, because that responds to children who are going to be out of care, but also children that are remaining with families, and what that means in terms of unification or rehabilitation. Certainly, a building block for me will be some idea around really recognise the importance of judicial independence as a kind of principle. You know, that's obviously a principle of governance for the whole of our society, but recognising that accountability is not the same as trying to oversee decision making by a judge. You know, that's not the same. The independence of the judicial decision making program must be promoted and protected. But we do need some idea in a local system that we've got an integrated governance and accountability structure to each other, that we sign up to that. May mean that the role of the judiciary is really much more clearly articulated, because at the moment, the judiciary is actually observers to the family justice system. There actually aren't people that operate in leadership roles in the local family justice board. They're supposed to be observers, but there's sometimes this kind of crossing of like, what does it really mean, and where is accountability? How do we track accountability? How do we hold ourselves in an accountable way? We obviously need a consistency around practice and the practice frameworks that are being applied, because we can see my role was to go up and down the country and talk to different people, and I could see very different ways of thinking about family justice, where you had much more sort of collaboration, integration, and you had much more separation. Other places where there were difficult relationships, and often then there was conflict being resolved in the court arena, which is the worst place for it to be taken to. And also, you know, the essential nature of prevention and early intervention, and that means how do we really think about pre-proceedings, you know, and how do we, in some ways, enable the court to get a sight of what that looks like before we're there. That's very radical, I know, because we shouldn't be there until there's an applicant, but we do have these pre-CAFCAS meetings now, pre-court meetings. There's the idea that a local authority can kind of say, this is what we're doing, you know, we might be coming to court, but this is the steps we're taking. What else do you think we should be doing before we come here? You know, because sometimes judges will say you should have come sooner or you came too late, you know. So there's an issue there for me about how we think about those prevention pathways. Obviously, the story of data and having clear data strategy. Oh God, what's there at the moment is just awful. It's awful for the local family justice system. And that goes to the national story, because there are the problems about what are we measuring and what are we so important, because the metrics at the moment are all about timeliness or delay. And those are really important, but they're just symptoms of the bigger issues. They're not the actual issues. They're symptoms of the fact that we don't have that collaborative sort of picture. We don't have a shared vision. Obviously, it goes along, you know, definitely, you know, support the workforce, upgrade and upskill the workforce. That's across the board. That means the lawyers as well as the social workers, you know, really understanding what that shared purpose is, because sometimes when you're in that system, the adversarial nature of it means that you feel like you're at war with each other rather than working collaboratively to make the best of children. And obviously, things that are already in place but are sometimes not applied. Judicial continuity. We know we've lost that because of what's happened in terms of the reduction in capacity of hours for judges. We haven't got the same judicial continuity we had in 2016. We don't have the same state in 2026. That can't be right. You know, that we have judges that are having to shift and move in case it's not staying with the same court. And like some sort of way of creating feedback systems, you know, a feedback system for learning in that local system. You know, and, you know, the obvious thing for me is, I'm gonna say this, John, you know, it's obvious to me that we do have a system out there already that's existing called sort of children partnerships that have to do all of this, you know, on a sort of statutory levels. And is there a way that we can think about that local system becoming part, local family justice system, becoming part of that, with the recognition that the accountability story in terms of independent judiciary, but the rest of the system being signed up to a way of working. You know, I can't see any other way but going that way, because we haven't got the resources or the funding to start a whole new system again. And it's not necessary for me when we've got things in place that would make it actually make much more sense. And we could actually get that little golden thread that we used to talk about years ago, working in that local system around local family justice. And in the best places, I'm going to shout out for Surrey and Sussex. You know, it works really well. They are really connected to their local children's partnerships, the way that they who they have on their board. You know, police, health people. You know, there's a real integration going on there. So those are some of my sort of building blocks.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And John, I could see you nodding to some of the points that Beverly was making there. I wonder whether you want to come in and add.
Yeah, I think on that final point, it's a really important observation. And how do we connect into bits of the system that already operate and align much more clearly. So, the link to the local safeguarding children partnerships is a really obvious one, and thinking about how we do that in context and a local authority footprint, that would be a really obvious connectivity. In all of our regions, we have regional innovation and improvement alliances. Most of those, if not all, will have mechanisms around things like peer review, peer challenge, networks that support practice development. Now, how can we connect it more broadly? That points about closing the learning loops and making sure that we're learning and developing. There was some very transferable models around things like peer review, peer challenge that could be applied on a system basis through a family justice lens. So I think there's elements of that. I think that massive opportunity and scope around workforce and connecting that into some of the practice elements that Beverly talked about, having clarity around practice framework, what problem solving models and approaches are going to be used, and then how do we think about the multi-agency workforce and the core skills and the ways in which we bring professional development into that arena to support that common understanding of those professionals who are working within that space, and do that across organizational boundaries in a really meaningful way. But you have to have a starting point in terms of understanding what your practice approach is going to be, what your objectives are going to be, how you're going to work, what you're trying to achieve to enable that to happen. So all roads do lead back to having that real consistency of strategy that has to come from national level and filter down and have real clarity on those objectives. I mean, data is a massive one, isn't it? And having a single version of the truth that everybody's aligned to, we understand, moving away from capturing sort of activity and timeliness as the sort of sole arbiters of positive outcomes. I think particularly understanding the impact of decision makings. I think it was mentioned in the first part by Beverly that the impact of a child or family's interaction with the family justice system doesn't change at the point or end at the point at which a decision is made and an order placed, and how do we understand the medium to long term impact of those orders in a way that we can develop and help the system to learn from. At the moment, we don't have any visibility on a lot of that. So how do we understand that and feed that into the broader learning around the system in a really meaningful way? Because it can't be the case that you get to the point of decision and court order, and then everybody just walks away and assumes everything's going to be perfect after that point. We know lots of the people in the system and lots of the organizations won't walk away and will continue to be involved. But actually, how do we really genuinely understand how decision making shapes the future outcomes for that child and for their family in a really meaningful way that can then help shape future policy, strategy design, and learning to enable the system to continue to improve? At the moment, I can't see any mechanisms that enable us to do that.
I mean, it's certainly a place where the judiciary, I mean, for many, many years have been asking for, the question, what happens to these children after I've made that order? What are the outcomes? Because I want to know if I'm making decisions that are actually going to create the kind of positive outcomes that we hope these decisions are aimed at. And so, this story of the data, and the need for kind of tracking these young people and getting a sense of what the outcomes are over time. It's a massive learning story then for our judiciary, because at the moment they're in the dark, and they're in the dark until the next member of that family may come through. Maybe that could be 10 years later. It could be the younger child who's now become the mother, and that child's coming through the system, and then the judges go, "Oh my God, I know this family. This was the whole story of recurrency." So we know something's not happening because we're having many people return. We have a particular cohort of families who are returning a lot over generations, and this is something fundamental there, not just about what's happening in the early stages, John, but what's going in the court process and how the court are responding. And that was quite a challenge for the court to recognise you influence this, an adversarial system is something which our England and Wales system is really kind of strapped to. But we know it's not the best way of producing the best outcomes for our young people, because we end up in a place where a lot of energy is spent in argument rather than in that inquiry as to what are the root causes and what is the best way of framing this? What is the best way of, what is the best order or no order? Yeah, that may lead to the outcomes we want for these young people. The system doesn't allow us to do that because we go into this kind of war zone. And although some courts are much more happier than others, it's still an adversarial system. We still believe the best way to get revelation or get to truth is this kind of conflict. And we're very unique in that way when it comes to family because the rest of the world doesn't do it like that. It, as a problem solving or inquiry way of looking at it, because we wanted to get to the best decisions for children, who are going to grow up to be the adults. It's their journey is just beginning. So I think these are like, I might be being slightly philosophical, but these are actually quite fundamental for me because it means a shift in cultures. It means a judicial practice that's very different to the one that we have because it's based on an adversarial system. And some of the fantastic judges you do meet on that individual level have kind of got that. And they understand I need to do something different in this space if I'm going to get to the right decision. All the evidence, all those things remain the same. But in problem solving, you're using power differently. In the problem solving, you're distributing power. So everybody's voice is heard because the more perspectives that we have on something, the better likely decision will be. It's a kind of logic.
Mm. Yeah, that's really helpful, both of you. And John, just thinking a little bit more about your perhaps your personal experience and your role as a DCS, but just this question of what could senior leaders in whether that's in local government or CAFCAS or the judiciary, if they wanted to take a bit more of a system-focused approach locally, where might they want to begin?
So I think for me, within the current context we're working in, so this is assuming we don't get the national change that we need within the current context we're working in. And yeah, I think it has to be about building relationships, about building common aims and objectives, understanding your patch and understanding what's happening. So what evidence do we have? What's working well? Um, I think there's definitely something in terms of the sort of connecting into the infrastructure as we've talked about. So, what are the connectivities across from the local family justice board into our regional networks, into local authorities, safeguarding children partnerships, for example. So what is that connectivity? How well is it working? Does it operate at all? Asking some of those curious questions. As a director of children's services, you're very much a system leader, and one of our core aims and ambitions is to create the space in which real high quality practice can flourish and to thrive and have the impact that we need to have for children and people. So asking those curious questions about how things are functioning now, making the connectivity into the systems that already exist, making that connectivity across into the families first reforms and ensuring that there's a real clear visibility of family justice as a core part of that continuum. And is seen in the whole of the interaction. There's some very um, positive ambitions in families first reforms about rebalancing and early help and focus and reducing the need for intervention at a safeguarding or legal level. However, we know the reality is that we can shift that, but we're not going to get to a world where there isn't a core role to play for the family justice system as part of that continuum, both before in the lead up through that sort of early intervention through to the point at which they might become involved to sort of any post order as we've discussed. So just understanding what that looks like on your patch and what sort of levers you've got locally to do that. And ultimately within really constrained systems, this is difficult, but you have to invest some time and some capacity into making it work. And that goes back to sort of making common purpose with other bits of the system and really understanding actually what are the benefits of getting this right. And the benefits of getting this right are really significant for children and families, but there are also significant benefits for the wider system in getting this right, and making sure that we have an ongoing functioning sustainable system that operates as part of that sort of integral part of that wider children's system. So I would say absolutely take an interest build some relationships, connect into everything else that you're doing, and think about it in that context, and put some challenge into the system and ask some of those difficult questions about how it's working.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good list to start with. I don't know, Beverly, whether there's anything you'd like to add to that.
And I can add any more, just emphasising the importance of, taking that interest and building those relationships, because it's got to start there, because until we get that power of a national driver, it's still going to be about that local leadership really, saying, okay, what will work for us and who do we need to be speaking to and who do we need to be connecting with to really enable that vision to come to pass, and it's given that encouragement, to local DFJ, that designated family lead, to feel comfortable and safe, that one isn't creeping onto the idea that the justice system becomes part of something not independent of the system that we are talking about, because I know that is like a legal necessity, but it's also a deeply held sort of belief, and cultural practice around the justice system's independent of the local authority. It has to be, but it doesn't mean that the way that we do the work and we don't have common purposes can't be shared in a safe and a forum where there isn't going to be a compromising on that. And that means giving encouragement to those leaders, meet with them, speak with them, find time to talk about those issues, not just be about when there's a problem in court that needs to be resolved, or, because sometimes it comes through that cycle and that's not going to take us forward.
And so thinking a little bit more now around, I guess, wanting to look ahead and think a bit more about kind of what this kind of could look like, what the kind of the positive future could be. And maybe this is a kind of good time to kind of remind those listening to the conversation today to put your questions that you have for John and Beverly, to put that in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we'll get to those shortly. But kind of one thing I wanted to ask for both of you, and maybe actually, Beverly, it's better to come to you first for this. But if the family justice system were working well, what would feel different for children, families, and professionals who are going through the system? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Do that. So right, here we go. Yeah, I think for all of those participants, it would be a system that was less adversarial. They would all experience something better from not being in a place where you're already feeling stress and strain, and you're already maybe carrying an experience of trauma, to walk into a space that is really adversarial, because that's really conflictual, angry, and triggering. So something that was more towards a trauma-informed problem-solving system would really impact all of those professionals. There would be more, it would be more of a relational practice, a racial way of being together, rather than scoring points. And John, to be honest, that's what sometimes goes on in court. There's a kind of this awfulness can happen. I've lived it for many years and seen it. It'd actually be more timelier, because you're actually focusing on the most important things, the things that really matter. You'll be focused on those. And people who experience it, and families have told this, they've told, the Public Law Working Group, they've told CAFCAS, they've told the NFGA when we've done research, that they will find it more humane, because they feel, they're already carrying a system which feels as though they've been shamed already, and they go into a system that shames them more. So something that is more humane. For children, the most important thing for me is that their voices are actually heard and they actually influence the decisions being made on them. And that's a radical shift, particularly public law, because we have a children's guardian representation system. But representation isn't the same as a young person being able to directly speak to the court of the age of and sufficient understanding about how they see their world, how they see their family situation, how they see their situation. That real power of agency for young people. I want to see that really unleashed in that new system. And that will mean that there may be a change in the relationship of what the role of CAFCAS may be going forward for older children. I'm not talking about little ones who need a voice representing them in express their own wishes and feelings. I think children, when we did the work at the NFGO called Care Files, and we talked about their experience in court, there was a sense of being emotionally unsafe for our older children and from our younger children, and feeling that the system just made things more unstable for them. So the sense that they would feel more emotional safety, because if their parents aren't expressing a sense of horror and anxiety and feeling like they're at war with their children, the children are at war with them, that would be like that would just be amazing. That would just change things so much. Professionals for me, the importance of being able to express a professional judgment and doing that well, because ultimately the evidence is there, but it's your professional analysis of that evidence and your framework of understanding and your knowledge base being properly respected. So social workers still today don't get the same respect as psychologists in court. And it doesn't matter how many times a leading president will say, I value the evidence of the social worker, the expert opinion always seems to override. And yet, who spends more time with the families and the children? Who knows the context of how they're living? The social worker and the professional. But also lawyers and barristers, working more collaboratively, working more relationally. It's a big change because they're trained in a form of advocacy. But when you're actually on the ground, people are not always the performance you see in the courtroom. They're always negotiating. They're always trying to find ways to move situations. And why don't we actually promote that? The idea that we're building a collaboration or trying to find consensus in outcomes for children in the court rather than the fact that we're in this war. I could go going on, but I'm going to stop. I've got a long list that I thought about, but I'll stop now and give John a chance to come in on this one.
Absolutely. Thanks, Beverly. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that entirely. I think that element around young people's voice is such a critical bit of it, and how that can be layered. So not just about individual voice in terms of a single young person's individual interactions with the court, but also how we fundamentally co-produce our strategy, design systems, and really understand children and families' experience as part of that, how we build experience in a meaningful way into evaluation and learning, and how we take things forward. And I think, there are good examples in other bits of children's services where it's probably quite a bit further ahead than it is in this space. And actually, how do we take some of the learning from some of the excellent practice around nationally, and start to take that and translate that through into how we make sure that young people's voice is really central to the way in which the next stage of development happens. I think that bit on respect and understanding of the different professionals involved is really critical. And by its very nature, the court process again has that power imbalance in built into it, and we have to really think about how that plays out and the way in which professional voices are heard and the weighting that is put on different voices. And I'd completely agree that the social worker's voice has to have a greater priority. I think it's not always the case, and I think there's a number of players as part of that overall system. Once you get into that court process, and as you say, it can be quite confrontational, quite difficult. But actually, within that space, it's really important to have a level of professional respect and understanding to support the best possible outcome as we move towards that, and then having real clarity about leadership and accountability. I think that's hugely missing at the moment. In a system which had much greater clarity around leadership and accountability for the professionals involved, would be a much better experience in terms of those interactions and ways of working.
Parents have told us it's very hard. Parents have told us it's very hard to feel that you could challenge, what a lawyer or a judge says. Who do I go to if I feel that that's been unfair on me? Who do I speak to? There's no follow-up. There's no way of doing that, and it's very difficult. These are challenging questions for professionals in the system because we aren't, apart from perhaps a local authority social worker, very hard to hold other people into account about how you think they've talked about you or referred to you or what they've said about your family, whatever. It's tested in court, and the argument is the evidence is tested in court, but that doesn't deal with the emotional impact on the family. It doesn't deal with the trauma and the re-traumatization that can happen for families when they're in that part of the system. And I think that's really important that we hold on to that. But you are right, John, the leadership and accountability structures and who do we go back to? Does a local family justice system really understand what's going on, inside that space? Where is the family rep on the board? Where is the child rep, or where is the systems of support for those to be able to access the board and influence and start to shape the way it's functioning and behaving? For some places that's a step too far, and for others it's like, wait, that's just not even a question for us. We should be there in that place. So we do need that national direction. Otherwise, we are still going to end up reproducing 1,000 different ways of doing it, in each area. There aren't 1,000, by the way, but I'm just saying that, there's only 44. But, it's difficult, really difficult.
Yeah.
But there's a reason why FDAT works, There's a reason why FDAT works. There's something there that is evidence to all of us as to why we can achieve a relational, trauma-informed, balanced and fair and just set of outcomes for children and families, where families accept the decision as legitimate because they feel they've been fully participating in the process, and the young people tell us that the same in FDAC, and all the professionals say the same. It's a much better experience for me if I'm in an FDAC court than another court, because I feel I've been heard. Why can't we replicate that? It can't be too difficult, so we take the key elements and do that.
So one more question from me, and then we'll start going to questions from the audience today. So final one, and I think John, I'll probably come to you first on this. So for professionals who want to improve their local family justice system and how it works and how it feels, but they feel constrained or worn down by that system, what advice or encouragement would you offer?
Yeah, and it can be really difficult, can't it? But I mean, I would start by saying, stick at it and focus on what's important. So focus on the impact that you can have for children and families if you get this right. Build relationships, find allies, build communities of interest. There's strength and power in those communities of interest that might be within your local system. They might be wider than your local system and networks across the country. There's loads of really good learning from Nuffield Family Justice Observatory and the research that they do, and some of the communities of interest that can sit around some of that research. So I think that there's some quite proactive things in terms of building those allies and communities. Think how best you can influence. So, from your position, where are you? What will be your levers? How do you get the hooks? What's the evidence? How do you get people to listen and to understand? And and some of that has to be about managing up. So, if you're in a local authority and your senior leaders aren't as engaged or interested as they could be, make the case to them, get them interested, get them engaged, take any opportunities within your local area to do that, to have those conversations, to think about why this is important in the broader system. Use the examples that are out there. There's some really good examples through the Trailblazer work, some really good examples through the research. Take those nuggets and help them to shape an argument at a local level, and be persistent. Don't let people say no.
Really helpful. And Beverly, is there anything you'd like to add to that as
Well,
well?
just say I agree with John, because that's a process that I went on the last 25 years. And then, you find the good people. But I think the power of the collective, and finding the communities of practice. Set one up yourself if you haven't got one locally. So anybody interested in looking at this area, this has been on my mind. This is what we did in Coventry when we looked at recurrency. We suddenly saw third or fourth generation coming through and thought, well, what's going on here? We need to do something differently about it. Reached out, and just at that moment, there was the emerging stuff around Paul's. Just as we were looking, Paul's was coming online, and it was like first symposium. Oh, yeah, this is a national movement. Look what's happened all these years. I mean, we're hopefully going to get something working together about needing to have recurrency services as part of child protection. I mean, takes years to campaign for it, but you can make that difference. And in your individual team, create those cultures that you want to see different things being done differently in the way that you're working with families or moving through that system and their children, hear their voices, hear their family voices, promote parent advocacy. All these things strengthen a context where we can do things differently in the family court.
Thank you. So we've had a question in the chat. So so I think this is probably in response to some of the conversation we've been having around FDACs and problem-solving approaches. So the question goes, what elements of the FDAC approach would you want to see mainstreamed into wider public law practice? I'm not sure who fancies us answering that one first.
I mean, I think it's got to be, I mean, there's a whole thing there around you have to fundamentally have a system which says that even though you're at a point where you're in the high end of it because you're in a family court. It might be the last point of intervention and the highest point of intervention. The possibility that there could be a positive outcome and a capacity to change story here has to be believed in. You actually have to believe that this intervention is going to make a difference that could end up with a positive outcome for a parent who may want a child returned, and a positive outcome where a child isn't returned, but the best decision is being made. That's a positive outcome because you've given everybody an opportunity to be tested, to be worked with in a way which is trauma responsive. Yeah, I certainly think the centrality of the social worker's relationship with children in FDACs is much stronger. So I certainly want to see, a problem solving approach. I would love to be in a world where we didn't sit in opposition, but we were sitting around that circle of a table and we were saying that we're actually here to achieve the fundamentals of the family justice system, which is to make the best decisions in the best way for these children. And here's a case management document. All of that happens in the family in an FDAC call. What you have is a culture that through collaboration and through a trauma-informed approach, you can unleash the potential for change in a parent and a parent's relationship with the child. And if we apply that in the family court, we'd have higher numbers, I think, of success, because sometimes it runs its own inevitable conclusion because parents don't feel safe in it, children don't feel heard in it, and professionals certainly don't feel that they're influenced in the way that they can, which FDAC creates that opportunity. And judges are in a completely different kind of mindset in FDAC court. They believe that they have that role in facilitating that prospect. They don't make it happen, but they facilitate it by the way that they build relationally with the participants, that's the child, and with the parents primarily.
John,
Yeah,
did you want to come in on that as well?
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, not much more to add to that. It's just about that culture, isn't it? And it starts to shift the focus on relationships, the focus on understanding trauma and the impact of trauma changes the relationship and the power dynamic in a way that you can be much more creative around solutions, and that's not necessarily just a reflection on the core elements of FDAC. A lot of the emerging models and problem-solving approaches have those same core cultural shifts, and I think probably the cultural bit of it for me is the most important bit. Yes, there's the mechanics of how it functions, but actually it's that complete mindset
It
shift and
is.
that
It's a
cultural
mindset
shift
shift.
that is the really critical.
Can I say to our question? There's a really good publication by the National Foundation on problem solving approaches in courts across the UK, and it's a really interesting paper about what are the core elements that work in problem solving. I can't remember the reference, but it's certainly on the National Foundation website. You can find it there if you want to know more about what
Yeah,
are key elements and what will be helpful. And obviously, Centre for Justice Innovation are doing a lot of that work as well.
yeah,
But it is about culture. It is about that cultural shift around. That's why if that works, because there is a belief that the impact can make the difference, the intervention can make the difference, and the difference is X, Y, and Z. We don't see things as being bad outcomes because we know that we feel confident you've got to a place where this is the right decision at the right time for this family, and that's really important.
yeah. And just to add to that, again, we will have a webinar next Tuesday with the Centre for Justice Innovation where we're looking at this in a little bit more detail as well. So do sign up to that. Another question that's come in says, what does effective leadership look like when people don't have formal authority within the system itself? So I'm not sure in terms of perhaps this might be coming from a place where someone has they're kind of
I,
in their role, they're not maybe a senior leader and they're trying to think about what they can do.
and I mean, I'm happy to have a bit of go at that. I mean, I think it comes back to those core elements of leadership, and leadership isn't a position, is it? It's a way in which you act and the way in which you operate and work and create space for the right conversations to be had and how you influence. And certainly, uh, within this space, system leadership is by its very nature influencing things that are outside your control, often outside your professional boundaries, and the sort of skill sets around building relationships and doing that. We talk about relationships a lot in children's service across all aspects of it, and that applies equally in terms of leaders as it does in any other aspect of our work, and having the skill sets to build relationships, going back to that point about building communities of interest in creating space and understanding, what the points of influence that you have and the opportunities you have to influence could be, and they may vary depending on where you are in the system, but actually you will have those points to be able to influence, and understanding what they are and how you use them, and fundamentally building relationships to enable those conversations to happen, to create the space for them to happen, I think is the key element.
We've got probably time for one more question. So I'll put this to both of you. This is from the Q&A again. So do you think that a return to the child's timescale and early input with and from the child, as per the Pathfinder, would help in public law proceedings?
I think, I mean, that's a good one. I think I'm going to say yes, but yes, plus plus, because we know that in terms of public law and the movement that we're seeing in children's social care, there's no children's social care leader out there who's not recognising the importance of child voice and child activity and child determination around what is written about us must be by us. We've got to have that shift, and I see that happening all over the country. I'm not worrying as much about that as I worry about what we can do in terms of influencing the family court, because in the family court, because it's that limited space and time, the criticality of it isn't quite there yet for me. So we've got child impact. That's not the same as actually having a very powerful co-produced view about what I think this system should do. Go and look at the Family Justice board, Young People's Board, and see their work that they're trying to do in the family justice system to really bring about centering children in the way the system is designed, new ideas about the system, new builds of the system. That's what we really need, in family justice. I'm not worried about social care and whether or not, because I know that work is happening, and it's vital and essential. Can't do the work without it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, thank you both. I'm very aware of the time that we're kind of pretty much at the end now. So thank you very much for the conversation. It's been great to hear you both. You've got such wisdom and such experience to share. I think it's been kind of really beneficial to hear from. Did want to quickly before we completely wrap up, I do want to flag again that this webinar is part of a series. So for those who are here listening and watching today, and we do have a few more coming up. So this is the next couple of weeks. So the next one on Monday, where we will be hearing from speakers from both PAWS and the Family Justice Young People Board that Beverly was just mentioning there. So this will really focusing on that importance of the voice of women and children involved in family justice and how that can be embedded a bit more and kind of what those messages are. And then on Tuesday, which again has been mentioned a couple of times, but is around the value of problem-solving approaches and what we can learn from that. And that'll be featuring Sophie Carter and Grace Tollett from the Centre for Justice Innovation, as well as many more. So please do follow the links on the screen, do sign up. All the information is on our website. But again, one last time, I want to thank you both. Beverly, John, thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions. It's been great to hear from you, and to all those who are watching, listening today as well. Thank you very much, and do follow up with us. Do get in touch if there is any questions you have or anything else you'd like to explore with us in a bit more detail. But yeah, one last time from me. Thank you, everyone, and speak to you all soon.